And the floor is yours, please, Tony. So everybody
Okay,
mute.
well, sorry. Thank you very much, Yoav, for inviting me to give this talk. It was quite an occasion last June, the meeting that was held in London of a wide variety of anti-Zionist groups and critical groups. And it was good to meet, and thank you for that plug for my book, and thank you for reading it. And of course, there's much more on this very subject, which we're talking about today, which people will find in that book. Um, I want to begin actually not um, directly with the words new anti-Semitism, but with reference to IHRA. I would guess that most of you, in fact, I'm pretty sure that all of you, are familiar with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, my talk is not focused specifically on IHRA, but I mention it from the outset because what is known as new anti-Semitism is not just a concept or an idea. It is a redefinition of anti-Semitism, which has been given formal status in IHRA, which in turn has achieved unprecedented international recognition. In fact, you hardly ever hear it referred to in its full form. It's enough just to say IHRA and everybody knows what you mean. Or actually, if you're talking to people in the States about this, they just refer to it as IRA. So it just goes to show how quote unquote popular, how well known this definition is, and it is really it is really the definition of anti-Semitism in the public space, and moreover, it's been given legal status in various jurisdictions, especially in the USA, even though the text of the definition itself opens with the words, and I quote, "This definition is not legally binding," uh, end quote. And that's being ignored almost universally. Uh, it's therefore fair to say that new anti-Semitism, rooted in the contention that Israel is the persecuted collective Jew among the nations, and that this redefinition of anti-Semitism has become the new anti-Semitism orthodoxy. Now, just a couple of sort of personal remarks to give some context to the way I'm going to present this. Um, my work in this area, I've been working in this area for over 35 years, and my work is research-based and academic, but also it has a unique first-person experiential dimension that does not usually figure in anti-Semitism studies. I've been an active participant in aspects of the developments we will be discussing today. Above all, opposing the politicization, weaponization, instrumentalization of anti-Semitism since the 1980s. At the same time, during the period I'm talking about, from the 1990s until recently, I was on a long journey away from Zionism to anti-Zionism. You have referred to a book I published in 2012, The Making and Unmaking of a Zionist, where I tell my story, which actually, when I finished that book, my journey, I suppose perhaps this journey is never at an end, completely at an end, but certainly I still at that particular time was not calling myself an anti-Zionist as I do now. Now, although probably first used in the 1930s, the term new anti-Semitism only acquired its contemporary meaning around the time of the Six-Day War in 1967, when it was applied to attacks on Israel and Zionism coming from the left, Palestinians, and later political Islamist sources, which were considered by some to be anti-Semitic. There was no consensus about this at first, but from the late 1980s, some academic and political opinion began to harden around the view that this quote-unquote new anti-Semitism was becoming more evident, more prominent, and that it was different from the so-called classical anti-Semitism, which singled out the individual Jew or Jewish communities, since it was directed at the Jewish state. Dissenters argued that there was no such thing as a new anti-Semitism targeted at Israel, and that any identifiable anti-Semitism in discourse about Israel was explicable within existing understandings of anti-Semitism, within existing definitions, and therefore there was no need to be singled out as new. We know that the notion of new anti-Semitism gained traction from published proceedings of organized discussions starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s in Jewish and Israeli circles that discussed the meaning of the erosion of support for Israel and its Zionist objectives at that time, as the problem was sometimes framed. Discussions which included many academics, intellectuals, writers, as well as officials of Zionist organizations and the Jewish Agency, who were responsible for Zionist education. The question of whether there was such a thing as new anti-Semitism figured in these discussions from the start, but did not initially dominate them. While all participants in these discussions were sympathetic to Israel and Zionism, they did include a smattering of mildly critical voices, and there was certainly no consensus on the issue of new anti-Semitism in the early years. All these discussions, held in Israel and in Jewish communities around the world, were organized by Zionist organizations or by Jewish communal bodies fully supportive of the Jewish state. The most significant of these discussions took place in Israel under the auspices of the office of the President of Israel. And the question posed was, why had liberal opinion started to turn against Israel and Zionism at that time? Had Zionist education somehow gone wrong? Did it need revamping, rejuvenating, rethinking? However, there was never any questioning of the legitimacy of Zionism or of the state or of what it did to come into existence, how it treated eternal other. In other words, these were discussions with a clear political motivation, linking the criticism of Israel and Zionism to anti-Semitism. And we see in concluding remarks made by one of the principal figures involved in organizing this process, both in the president's office and around the world, the late Professor Yehuda Bar, the Holocaust historian, then head of the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University, who said at one of these discussions in Israel towards the end of the 1980s that the consensus was among all the people, or the vast majority of the people participating in these discussions, was that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now, a key influence on these developments was the policy changes of Israeli governments on the issue of anti-Semitism. Unwilling to engage publicly in confronting anti-Semitism in diaspora communities for most of the first 4 decades of the existence of the state, since it would have negated the Zionist claim that Zionism would eliminate anti-Semitism, the Israeli government decided to reverse its stance, setting up what was called the Government Monitoring Forum on Anti-Semitism in 1988, and mobilizing the Mossad to coordinate the monitoring and combating of anti-Semitism by Jewish communities under Israel's leadership. Around this time, in meetings with Eliakim Rubinstein, the cabinet secretary, and the government forum, the government forums on anti-Semitism's first chairman, British embassy officials noted critically, and I quote, "There is a tendency to equate criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism," end quote. Now, during the Oslo process, beginning in the early 1990s, this new Israeli policy, though not abandoned in any way, was nonetheless put on the back burner because of issues to do with possibilities of some kind of peace being achieved. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. The element that continued was increased cooperation on monitoring, research, and assessment among Jewish defense and anti-Semitism research groups, but only those formally approved by Jewish communal representative organizations and the Mossad agents working with the monitoring forum. But when Oslo ran into the sand, when global anti-Semitism was judged to have spiked and perceived domestic and international threats to the state of Israel intensified around the turn of the century, Israeli governments engaged with increasing vigor with the issue of anti-Semitism, seeing it as of their international interest, restructuring their institutional agencies dealing with the matter. Any reservations on the part of the major diaspora Jewish institutions dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism, which at one time jealously guarded their independence on the matter, were put aside, and the Israeli government's lead role was essentially affirmed. By that time, there was a growing number of new anti-Semitism protagonists who were convinced that events at the turn of the century, for example, the Second Palestinian Intifada, the UN Anti-Racism Conference in Durban, which was said to be riddled with expressions and manifestations of anti-Semitism, 9/11, etc., had sparked a major spike in global anti-Semitism of the new type. Opinion in Jewish defense and representative organizations, as well as some research and monitoring groups, shifted decisively at this time towards embracing the assessment that new anti-Semitism had come to be the principal danger to the security of Jews in Israel, since the alleged anti-Semitic anti-Zionism was targeted at them, and outside Israel because of the spillover of the events in the Middle East into countries with diaspora communities. These days, it's generally overlooked that another significant factor had influenced both the Israeli government's decision to take the lead in coordinating Jewish monitoring and action against anti-Semitism worldwide, and the decisions of major Jewish organizations with international agendas, the World Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, to step up their political campaigning against and dissemination of information about anti-Semitism, principally in Europe. This was the resurfacing of political anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism in 1989. This posed a challenge to institutes like the Institute of Jewish Affairs, the research arm of the World Jewish Congress, which I directed from 1991 and where I had worked since 1979. Anti-Semitism in Europe was one of our main research interests. In addition to grappling with the issue of the alleged anti-Semitic nature of criticism of Israel, the salience of the revival of political anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe demanded research and analysis. Our response was to launch a human rights-style country-by-country annual report on anti-Semitism based on common categories of anti-Semitic manifestations and other factors that illuminated the state of anti-Semitism in each country. The first volume appeared in 1992 and continued in printed form until 1999. At the same time, the IJA, although independent of any UK Jewish representative body, as an organization serving the World Jewish Congress, it was included in the Israeli government's new drive to lead and coordinate anti-Semitism monitoring. I was therefore a participant in meetings with a Mossad official working out of the Israel embassy in London. But it soon came clear to me that Mossad's brief was not solely focused on defending Jewish communities against anti-Semitism. Equal attention was being given to using heightened awareness of anti-Semitism among young Jews to foster Zionist sentiment and encourage Jewish immigration. This was one of the main reasons why the Forum and the Mossad insisted on working only with so-called approved Jewish organizations dealing with anti-Semitism. The actual mechanics of this cooperation was largely focused on data gathering, research, reporting, and assessments, a task that Mossad had given to its new public face on this, and that was a new institute set up at Tel Aviv University by Professor Dina Porat. The funding for this was provided by the Mossad for a number of years at least. It was entirely unexpected. It was not entirely unexpected that Porat would be happy for her institution to be an instrument of Zionist objectives. But we were not alone in our surprise that she would jeopardize academic credibility in this way. And actually, in time, the Mossad stopped funding the operation. At the same time, it emerged that Porat's project was planning to issue its own annual anti-Semitism report in competition with the one that we were producing. Mossad wanted us to cooperate with them and cease issuing our own IJA anti-Semitism world report. This situation presented IJA with a fundamental challenge. Its work on anti-Semitism was driven by the basic principle of objectivity, as far as possible, not allowing political, ideological, or emotional considerations to cloud the quest for hard evidence and unbiased analysis and judgment. We understood that the Israeli government was free to pursue Zionist objectives in its engagement with the anti-Semitism question, but it was inconceivable to me and my staff that the IJA would cooperate with Mossad and Tel Aviv University under these conditions. In effect, we were refusing to accept making new anti-Semitism in the embryonic form guiding the Mossad, the Israeli government, Porat's Institute, and soon also the major international organizations, the center of concern for the IJA. Meanwhile, the World Jewish Congress, falling in line with the Israeli government, had organized a major international conference titled My Brother's Keeper, Anti-Semitism and Prejudice in the Changing World, to be held in Brussels in July 1992. Several heads of state attended, representatives from Jewish communities in 60 countries were there. Jesse Jackson addressed a capacity crowd of 1,000, and it was at this conference that IJA presented its first annual Anti-Semitism World Report. Coincidentally, or more than coincidentally, it was at this conference that one of the principal promoters over the years of the notion of new anti-Semitism, Professor Erwin Kotler from Canada, who became the Canadian Justice Minister in the Liberal government at one time, set out his rationale for the idea to a high-profile, influential audience. Kotler, in particular, those promoting the notion of new anti-Semitism, Kotler in particular, sometimes referred to as new anti-Semitism theorists, were from the early 1990s claiming that new indices were needed for measuring it, and that therefore a new definition, formal definition, was required To fight this anti-Semitism, the American Jewish Committee's Rabbi Andy Baker stated 2 decades later, quote, "We had first to define it," end quote. But despite the continuing frenetic public debate in the first years of the new millennium about whether anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hostility was a new anti-Semitism, there was no clamor for a new definition, nor was there a widespread view that combating this alleged anti-Semitism was hampered by the absence of such a definition. This was a narrative concocted years later as part of a propaganda, Israeli propaganda in particular, on this matter. From that time on, I was increasingly warning in public about the dangers of allowing the study and monitoring of anti-Semitism to be closely bound up with the Zionist imperative. There was some sympathy for my views among some academics, but there was a very angry response from many and from Jewish community leaders, particularly in the United Kingdom. It was clear which way the wind was blowing. The first significant attempt at launching a new definition only emerged at a meeting of Israel's Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism in February 2004. A press release from the time stated that it, quote, may best be remembered for a unique intellectual achievement, a first for its kind agreement among Jewish leaders worldwide on a definition of new anti-Semitism. The press release went on, when criticism of Israeli policies involves the application of gross political and diplomatic double standards against the state of Israel, or invokes demonizing terminology against Israel or Zionism, or denies Israel the fundamental right to exist. That criticism cannot be regarded as legitimate, this definition said. Rather, it clearly constitutes anti-Semitism and should be labeled as such. The former Russian Jewish dissident Natan Sharansky had the government's anti-Semitism brief at that time, and this definition clearly reflected his thinking, as elements of it were included in his what came to be called 3D's definition of anti-Semitism, published in Jewish Political Studies Review in autumn 2004. These were 3 tests: demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. It was anti-Semitic to subject Israel to these 3 discourses, Sharansky argued. But these definitions were soon to be eclipsed. A major step change occurred when the European Union Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC, published on its website a working definition of anti-Semitism in January 2005, focusing largely on Israel and Zionism. It was hailed as a game-changing definition, initially achieving significant international attention and approbation. The process of EUMC undertaking this task came about at the urging of Rabbi Baker of the American Jewish Committee. A draft definition of anti-Semitism produced a year earlier by Ken Stern, the AJC's anti-Semitism expert, was taken by the EUMC as its starting point. Contrary to the claim that this was the result of years of scholarly research and discussion, in fact, it was originally and fundamentally a political project, opportunistically planned and implemented by a small group behind closed doors, only with participants who were sympathetic to the notion that there was a new anti-Semitism. The final draft differed very little from Stern's original text. The false narrative claiming that many Jewish groups were involved served to give legitimacy to the process. But within a couple of years, in fact, criticism of that definition mounted. The EUMC was replaced by the Fundamental Rights Agency in 2007, which actually distanced itself from the working definition and took it down from its website. At this point, there's no disagreement about what happened. Israel's agencies devoted to the anti-Semitism issue, together with the major international Jewish organizations, particularly the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the American Jewish Committee again, and others agreed to find a way of reintroducing the working definition into the public domain and chose what was then called the ITF, the Task Force for International Cooperation on the Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, which was chaired by Yehuda Bar, as the vehicle for this. This body changed its name to IHRA, something that was much less of a mouthful, in 2012. And they facilitated this, though ITF had not been directly engaged in combating anti-Semitism. It was the Simon Wiesenthal Center, through its then director of Government Affairs, Mark Weitzman, who chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, which played the major role in persuading the organization to put the EUMC working definition with minor amendments up for adoption by the members of the organization as the IHRA working definition. Again, it's inconceivable that experts labored for some years or even just months to produce the final text. Just as the EUMC version was very close to the AJC's Stearns text, so too the IHRA version differs from the EUMC text. In May 2016, IHRA's General Plenary in Bucharest adopted by consensus a document comprising two distinct parts: a two-sentence working definition of anti-Semitism and a list of 11 examples of purportedly anti-Semitic statements. However, this document, in its entirety, is now overwhelmingly understood to be the IHRA working definition. Now, this is completely inaccurate. While there was a great deal of confusion surrounding what happened in Bucharest, and various actors, including officials of the IHRA, have engaged in deliberate obfuscation about what occurred, a definitive PhD study on the event and subsequent related developments by Jamie Stern-Wiener, a DPhil student at Wolfson College, Oxford, reveals categorically that it is only the two-sentence opening text that constitutes the working definition that was adopted. In respect of both the EUMC and the IHRA processes, the lead actors, Baker of the AJC for the EUMC version, Weitzman of the SWC for the IHRA version, insisted that they were responding to widespread demands for a new definition, and that academics and researchers spent many months for the former, even years for the latter, deliberating and consulting over the texts before agreement was reached, thereby proving how authoritative and foolproof they were. As the experts of the UK delegation to the IHRA put it in 2018, and I quote, "The IHRA's network of experts was compelled in 2016 to address the global rise of anti-Semitic incidents by putting forth a clear gold standard definition of what anti-Semitism consists of." End quote. That definition, the UK delegation to IHRA categorically insisted, was the entire text, including all the examples. The fact that the IHRA Secretariat released the UK statement itself seemed to IHRA clearly constitutes a formal, clearly shows that IHRA constitutes a formal codification of new anti-Semitism. But the interests of pro-Israel and Zionist groups, if the examples are considered as an integral part of the definition, supporters of the examples have therefore deliberately misrepresented their status. Fully 7 of the 11 examples concern statements about Israel. They include criteria which can be used to stigmatize and stifle a broad swathe of international criticism of Israel, such as, quote, applying double standards to Israel. Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated at the time that, quote, what pro-Israel activists deem essential is the list of examples, end quote. The AJC goes so far as to decree that, quote, essentially, the definition is the examples, end quote. And so new anti-Semitism, the material expression of the alleged equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, has had its orthodox status confirmed. It's not just an expression of current anti-Semitism. Some argue that for most Israeli Jews and many Jews in the diaspora, it's probably the only manifestation of anti-Semitism they recognize. My concluding few sentences. It's clear that the thrust of new anti-Semitism definition was increasingly to draw attention to the form and nature of the iniquities allegedly imposed on Israel by anti-Zionists, principally Palestinians and their supporters. What codification of a new anti-Semitism in IHRA has done is widen the pool of those who can be included as anti-Zionists and therefore as anti-Semites. Swept into this net are the growing number of Jews protesting against genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and now also branded as anti-Semites. Taken together, the concept of new anti-Semitism and its codification in IHRA has produced an anti-Palestinian charter of murderous power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for this presentation. We are always in the present time, facing these different shitstorms coming on us from different directions today, and it's very interesting and I think eye-opening to see the origins of this process and how it developed in the past few decades, actually. So who wants to start with a question? Maybe you can raise your hand and open your microphone simply. We can have a short debate on this. If you have any question or to Tony or something to add. Yeah, Vivian, please.
Hello, Tony. Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I'm often wondering at this time, how useful is it for us to be considering anti-Semitism in isolation from other racisms, especially when the right is mobilizing to condemn all kinds of aggressive movements, including the anti-Zionist movement, as anti-Semitism, and focusing supposedly on anti-Semitism. Should we be considering anti-Semitism in isolation from other forms of racism, even though it's got a specifics very different from other racisms, I think?
Sure. Shall I respond straight away, Yoav? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can take.
Okay. Right. I agree with you absolutely, Vivian. I think it's quite clear that that we shouldn't be focusing only on anti-Semitism. We should be looking at it within the context of racism in general. There is, in the UK, for example, quite a sort of lively debate at some degree going on about this, because there is some people who are arguing that anti-Semitism it will never be confronted properly in this country unless it is considered by the left, in particular, as a whole, to be an issue that it should take up together with dealing with racism in general. So I'm fully with you on that. However, there is a strain of opinion which I've heard, which whilst arguing that, nonetheless sort of puts anti-Semitism at the root of all racisms. And I find that actually rather difficult to accept, because I don't think there is evidence to suggest that all racism comes from from anti-Semitism, as if, and anti-Semitism is sometimes referred to as the longest hatred. But that was actually the title of a book by Robert Wistrich, the late Robert Wistrich, who was one of the main proponents of the idea of new anti-Semitism. So I think that the racisms need to be fought together, but there has to be some clarity, and I think some moving away as far as possible from any kind of Jewish exceptionalism on this. And I'm afraid that there is, I think, somewhere in some of the talk and discussion about anti-Semitism, there is a degree of that sense that there is something special which is facing Jews, and I think this is dangerous.
I do too. Thank you.
So we have a question from Naama from Spain, please.
Hi, thank you for the very useful information. I'm just a little bit confused because while you presented all the information, you were referring to anti-Semitism, and the book, which I, of course, have not read, otherwise I wouldn't be asking, refers to new anti-Semitism, but all the process you mentioned was all about manipulating the claim for anti-Semitism in order to protect the Zionist project and to reject a criticism of Zionism and of Israel. So I didn't hear that you implied it, and in your conclusion, it's obvious that that's where you are. But I think there is anti-Semitism. I don't know if it's worth being called new or old or just anti-Semitism. But calling anti-Israel as it's like you're accepting when you talk about, as you say, they were working against the ministry or whatever for anti-Semitism, and that they were trying to fight anti-Semitism. No, they were not. So I think it's very confusing for, especially if people who are less informed or less already been thinking about this for a long time. It's very important to not even allow them to call this anti-Semitism, and to deal with it as a manipulation, because we want to keep to protect the term anti-Semitism in order to talk about real racism and anti-Semitism that exists in all kinds of creative expressions, let's say.
Yes, no, I agree with you absolutely, 100%. Maybe I'm just sort of trying to be a little bit sort of not balanced, because there isn't any balance here. Indeed, I mean, it'd be unfair to say that every single person who is involved in some Israeli ministry to do with anti-Semitism, isn't feeling that they are fighting real anti-Semitism, but we know that what they are doing is actually using anti-Semitism for propaganda purposes, using anti-Semitism to cover up the terrible things that it's doing in the West Bank and in Gaza and so on. And this is, this is very there from the very beginning, as I stated in my remarks, when the Israeli government, decided it was going to take on this issue, which it didn't deal with, for 4 decades because it didn't fit in with Zionism. That they were doing it for Zionist purposes. The Mossad people at the time, I mean, it may sound strange, but this is absolutely true. The Mossad people at the time were quite clearly using this as a sort of recruiting tool for Aliyah, for immigration to Israel. So we shouldn't be giving any credence to the work of Israeli organizations and many of the other organizations elsewhere. The Anti-Defamation League, for example, which I think is having a terrible influence on the understanding of anti-Semitism in America and the way it's going. Fortunately, facing a lot of pushback from non-Zionist groups in the States, particularly Jewish Voice for Peace. Um, so yes, we have to expose what Israel is doing, but it's an uphill it's an uphill struggle, and it's not getting any easier. Um, and and there's a sense in which the what's happening in America and the clampdown on dissent in the universities there, and particularly singling out Jews as well as obviously Palestinians for being cancelled and so on and so forth. That you're now in getting a more full on branding of Jews as anti-Semites in an increasingly public way. There was a very interesting article published in the Guardian newspaper here just a couple of days ago. It's a long article which goes into this very phenomenon of of how the degree to which Jews now are so much also certain Jews are being accused of being anti-Semite. It's not just the self-hating Jew phrase that's being used, but literally being accused of anti-Semitism and being therefore, facing, because of legislation in America, faced with being prosecuted for being anti-Semites. I mean, it's deeply worrying, and we have to fight back in whatever way we can. But clearly we have to understand exactly what's going on.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yes, thank you, Tony, for that very interesting and eloquent description of the new anti-Semitism. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think of that saying. I forget who said it, but as you were talking about the new anti-Semitism, I just kept thinking of that phrase of anti-Semites used to be people who hate Jews. Now anti-Semites are people who Jews hate. And I was wondering if, as I was thinking that, you might have already talked about this, so I apologize if I missed it. But I was just thinking of the time that the United Nations Security Council declared Zionism to be racism. And then about 15 or 20 years later, they reversed that. So I'm wondering if that might have something to do with this new, or maybe was the beginning of this wave of looking at Zionism as Judaism, and it might be at the core of or the beginning of this process of looking at of declaring anti-Zionism to be anti-Semitism.
I think there's a lot in what you say. I would just point out, Peter, that it was actually a General Assembly resolution.
The General Assembly. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Which indeed was then overturned in because it was 1975 that
75,
racism
in the early 90s, 93 or 90 something around there.
That was
91?
all.
Okay.
That was all linked to
91,
yeah. That was all linked to the Madrid conference, which led to which eventually led to the Oslo process.
Oslo.
So, but I think you're absolutely right. It was I remember very well, actually, that those days after the passing of the original resolution, saying Zionism equals racism, and the concern that there was among Jewish organizations at the time. What was interesting, and from my recollection at the time, was that although there were some, and I think was it Abba Eban, or certainly one of the principal Israeli politicians who branded it as anti-Semitic. It may have actually have been Herzog, who was the who was the UN representative of Israel at the time, who called it anti-Semitism. But actually, quite a lot of the organizations in America, I think, that were pushing back against it, actually treated it more as a political issue at the time. That,
I'm just to say I lived in Los Angeles at the
oh,
time, and I remember walking around Westwood Village with a very proudly with a "I am a racist" button.
right.
Back at the time when I was a Zionist.
But certainly that was one of the developments along the way, which was grist to the mill of those people who wanted to push the idea of anti-Zionism being anti-Semitic.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wanted to ask a question or comment?
Yes, please, if I can.
Ronald, please.
Yeah. What I think is peculiar, very strange in a way, that the meaning of the word anti-Semitism must have been or is disappearing in some way, because the Palestinians are Semites, Jews are Semites, and being accused of being an anti-Semite is something which is I believe is something that we must address, that it is actually nothing else than anti-Zionist. And that is okay for me. I am comfortable with that terminology, with that definition of my reality in a way, yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say in response to that. I mean, are you declaring yourself as an anti-Semite, or you're just declaring yourself as an anti-Zionist?
That's very good, because that is exactly my point. I think it is important to uh, to to um, to make sure that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and I really want to underline the importance that anti-Zionism is something else, and we fight anti-Semitism as well
Yeah.
as we do fight against anti-Zionism, don't we? But if we make it such a blurry thing, something so unlogical, I think this is an important thing. We just state that Palestinians, as far as I know, are are Semites as well. Yes. So I'm sorry. I think
Mm.
it's
Well,
important to address this in one and another way. Thank
mm,
you.
yeah, thank you, Ronald. And we have a couple of questions more. We have Hadass, who has her hand, and later Ernesto and Vivian.
Yeah, thanks, Jaap. And thanks, Tony, for the great talk. So I'm based in Germany. I'm from the Jüdische Stimme, Jewish Voice here in Germany. In here, it's yeah, you probably know it's a whole total kind of craziness. And it really feels like we're trying to expose what's going on. Everybody, like you are, trying to expose what's going on, this manipulation that's been going on. There's been so many letters by experts, also from Israel, Jewish experts, historians, and so on. There's been the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism. Everybody up there in the government are just ignoring it. What else can we do?
Well, it's a very good question. I know it's a terrible situation in Germany. I mean, it's just extraordinary, um, the degree to which Germany has appropriated, as it were, its responsibility for the Holocaust as part of its raison d'etre, its raison d'etat. And at the very same time, it's it's indulging in direct persecution against Israelis and Jews and people who are speaking up for Palestinians. It's I know people there and who are absolutely in despair over it, and I don't see. I mean, I can't. I'm not familiar enough with German politics to know whether this is something which is going to be pushed to the sidelines because of other European issues to do with Ukraine and so on and so forth. But it's extremely dangerous, dangerous situation. I mean, I would say one thing which I think can help. It's not just the long run, but um, that is a greater coming together of organizations like the one that you have in Germany and like we have in other countries, which many of which are now clustered under this heading of this new organization, Global Jews for Palestine. My own sense is that a wider global movement of anti-Zionist groups it would be something which could make a difference because it helps prevent people like yourself and others in countries where the clampdown on dissent, the clampdown on criticism of Israel, etc., is very strong. It helps. It gives them a wider sense of belonging to an international movement that has some voice and has some. It doesn't have any kind of physical power or anything like that, but could have very significant rhetorical power. And the words count, actually, as we know. I mean, in what I was saying at the beginning of my talk about IHRA, it's amazing how this this acronym has become so well known around the world. Well, we should, from our perspectives of what we're trying to achieve in the groups that we belong to try and achieve that same kind of influence on opinion, on use of language, which would make it clearer to wider society and to people generally that the positions that we hold and especially as Jews are perfectly legitimate and indeed should be taken very seriously and also respected. So I don't have any answers, and I know people who are working hard in Germany, trying to face these kinds of things. I mean, I myself, I've got an essay actually coming out in a book being published by the Einstein Forum. And they did a major conference a couple of years ago on the weaponization of the Holocaust, which I think caused a lot of fuss at the time. And I understand that this book, which Susan Nyman is the editor of, I believe it is coming out, but I understood that that they were afraid that somehow someone would find some reason to suppress this book of essays and papers. Fortunately, I haven't heard that is going to happen, and hopefully it will be published. But it must be extremely difficult situation there. Sorry, I can't offer any more.
Thanks.
Ernesto?
Yes, I am calling from Sweden. And in your book, Antony, you mentioned the word Judeophobia, but you state that you are not using that word in your book because it can create more confusion. Can you please talk a bit about this? Because I understand that what is anti-Semitism, the accepted definition today is a weapon, is weaponized to defend Israel, and has very little to do with the classical anti-Semitism and with hate of the Jews. But Judeophobia could be a more appropriated word. So please, can you explain a bit about this?
Well, I suppose on this, I'm kind of a pragmatist in a way. I mean, I know, quite a number of academics who, very good, serious historians of anti-Semitism who indeed have argued that it would be better to be using a word like Judeophobia. Um, and I understand the arguments, and I respect the people who make those arguments, because indeed anti-Semitism, is a problematic term. But as I say, I'm rather pragmatic about this, because I see, to now enter into an effort, a fight to change the name altogether, I think is not the best use of our energies. I think, we've got the word anti-Semitism, we're stuck with it, and we should be able to reclaim it, if you like, rather than search around, because I think there are also people who are on the other side of the debate to us on this, who want to use the word Judeophobia. So it's not as if it is something which would only benefit those of our persuasion on this issue. So I just feel that too much sort of tinkering, as it were, with definitions. I mean, I think one of the big problems in relation to IHRA, for example, is that too many people, and I think too many academics, took the thing seriously, and therefore the attempt to come up with an alternative definition, the Jerusalem Declaration, was one attempt, and there was another one at least. I always felt was doomed exercises, because the people who put together IHRA were not interested in any kind of debate with academics about defining anti-Semitism. It was quite clear, that this was, a propaganda exercise, ultimately. So to get drawn into discussions about whether we should use that word or this word, I just feel we're just going to make life even harder for ourselves than it is at the moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Yeah, sorry. We talked, but I'm very paranoid right now, so I'm trying to be low key. But I'm from Belgium, or I live in Belgium, and I know you just said you don't want to go into the semantics of Semite or Judeophobia, but I did want to point out, because I've heard this a lot, this argument that Palestinians, Arabs are Semites and Jews are Semites, and I like, because it was mentioned earlier, and I also think that is counterproductive, because then we get in a sort of question of who can be anti-Semitic, who can say this, who can say that, and I think that goes beyond the point of anti-Semitic. Like you said, we're stuck with the word anti-Semitism. I don't think it's productive to change it, but I also don't think it's productive to use the word Semite as the definite. Like, anti-Semitism now stands for hatred of Jews, but going into the idea of Semite goes into these racial distinctions that are outdated and still racist, and I think not helpful for anyone. And this is not really a question, but since it was brought up earlier, I've heard a lot, this whole who's a Semite, who's not, and but thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Sue from Ireland.
Hi, folks. Sorry, I've got my camera off because I was eating my dinner. But hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Antony, for the talk. Always good to hear your voice and to learn about how things are going. It's a sort of practical question. And Annie, I think we were in Dublin on Saturday at the National Demo, some of the Jews for Palestine Ireland, and got the chance to have a chat with Omar Barghouti, which is always another good thing. And people may or may not be aware that the Irish government, which recognised the state of Palestine, which hasn't enacted the Occupied Territories Bill, so a lot of words, not a lot of action, has very recently put the IHRA into the programme for government without consultation. So they sneaked it in at the very last moment and they went to the White House. But anyway, so the question we're debating is how we create, how we sort of push back against that, both at trade union level and, campaign level. And we've got a broad anti-racist campaign. So I'll not go into all those because they're very interesting discussions. And we were advised by another great person who was in Dublin, Francesca Albanese, as a last resort, and Omar confirmed this, to push the Jerusalem Declaration because it specifically refutes the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, obviously, a lot of people have reservations about that. I just wondered what your view was on that.
Well, as you heard already, I'm not the greatest fan of the Jerusalem Declaration, although I recognize actually the effort and time that was put into it by a lot of very fine historians and others who I respect. But I was struck at the time by the degree to which there were many Palestinians and Palestinian organizations that were not happy with the Jerusalem definition, because as I understood it, and I must say I have great sympathy with this, that just the very fact of bringing Palestinians into a definition of anti-Semitism is itself a mistake. And of course, it does refer to Palestinians directly, and actually, directly to say that, they aren't anti-Semites. But on the other hand, as I say, my understanding is that quite a number of, leading Palestinians and Palestinian organizations were not happy that that problem of the way Palestinians are branded as anti-Semites is dealt with in that definition. That's not what that definition should be for. Fighting back against the delegitimization of Palestinians and accusing them of anti-Semitism is, as it were, fight in itself and on its own. But I mean, I think, if one wants a tool, I suppose the Jerusalem definition is it's certainly better than anything else. There is, I don't know whether you know that here in the UK at I think it's University College, which adopted IHRA, or said they were going to adopt IHRA, and there was a major fight. There was a major pushback led by some academics there, which succeeded in getting the university to at least put on hold the formal acceptance of IHRA, but also to bring the Jerusalem Declaration into their considerations when issues of anti-Semitism came up. So I'm just wondering whether, for example, that kind of experience, that sort of success, the degree to which they had success on that, might be something which you and Ireland might want to look at and look into to see whether that would help in any way in terms of what you're trying to do there. I mean, I can give you the names of the people who were involved in that, if you like.
That would be brilliant. And I mean, I think we're all reluctant to do that. And we're meeting shortly, I think next week, to discuss it. But it was advice given. I mean, what Omar said was the BDS have a very clear analysis of the IHRA. But they do say at the very end that as a last resort, you know, if it's a question of pushback. And I think it's a question here of the pushback has to happen fairly quickly. This has happened recently, so it's not, you know, it's not institutionalized. But I've heard from trade union colleagues today, because we were outside an EU conference in Belfast protesting the presence of Histadrut, that there is a motion on the IHRA at an upcoming trade union conference. So it's sort of kick-started, you know, a sort of push for the IHRA. So I think we need to use all the tools. But that would be great, Anthony. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yes. Vivian again, and then Peter and Nama.
Yeah, thank you. I think debating definitions of anti-Semitism is beside the point, because this isn't a campaign about anti-Semitism. It's about suppressing the Palestinian voice and story. And so I think getting caught up in alternative definitions, although, you know, as a last resort, if in part of a struggle you can propose an alternative definition, which would be better, that's okay. But I don't think that should be the focus of our attention. And referring to the issue about the use of anti-Semitism to mean prejudice against people Arab heritage, that's beside the point too, because anti-Semitism is a European word for a European phenomenon, and it's as sensible to call it as referring to Arab people as it is to call someone from Lesbos a lesbian.
Yeah, I agree.
Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, first, thank you, Sue, for that very useful and practical input. I just want to say that I find it useful to, when referring to anti-Semites and Zionism, just to remind people that Herzl himself predicted that anti-Semites would become the Zionists' best friend. That people tend to have a hard time squaring that circle.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very important. It's important to bring out, you know, when you look into the literature, it's not only Herzl, you know, you know, Ben Gurion. I mean, you know, the major leaders that at one time were feted and were considered to be such wonderful socialists or whatever they were. You know, some of the things that they said you know, and sort of quietly sometimes, you know, out of the side of their mouths, which made it perfectly clear that that they really didn't want anybody else in the land but themselves. That was it. I think it was Herzl actually who also said that, you know, we will sort of quietly push the natives or something like this over the border. There's some kind of quote like that, which is quite telling, and, you know, which speaks to the settler colonialism nature of what Zionism was and is doubly so.
Nama, you had a question again? Yes.
I just have a very short comment about the term anti-Semitism that people were discussing. Exactly a year ago, a member of our group, Wieland from Germany, as an anecdote in his presentation in Paris, he mentioned this. It was actually the only thing I remember very clearly from this whole marathon of 30 speakers in one day. And I think it's very useful, because I also had this argument for years, many times, and I always just dismissed it as a semantic game, that it's the name that was put for the hatred of Jews or racism against Jews, and it's a wrong term, but that's what's used, and starting to play with who is Semitic or not is irrelevant for the term anti-Semitism. So it turns out that what he explained to us, that historically it was, I think, in the 17th century, 18th century, in order, as the anti-Jewish sentiment was growing, basically as a response to their assimilation in Germany. And in order to identify them or to separate them from the German public or the German culture, they were labeled as Semites, to say, no, you shouldn't mistake them for good Germans, they are Semites. And then they used the term anti-Semitism as keeping the Jews away or protecting the Germans from the Jews infiltrating into their social, economical, controlling them by labeling them as Semites, as Arabs, in order to say they are not Germans, even though they might look so. So it's not a coincidence that it's a term that is not exactly adequate.
Right.
But also I think it's what is not said enough. Maybe to us it's clear that everyone who hates Jews or has prejudice against Jews, 90% of these people hate Arabs even more, especially being in Europe. I'm not talking about the Arab world, prejudice against Jews. But being in Europe, I think it's very important to expose that all the people who have anti-Islamist and anti-Arab expressions, if we look, we might very well find also prejudice against Jews. And it's very good to put them together and to show that they go together. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
Then Ernesto, please.
Yes, I have a couple of comments, and I want to hear your reaction to this. The first is that it is indeed a kind of theology about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been a kind of religion, like it was in the Middle Ages, and the anti-Semites or presumed anti-Semites are treated as heretics. This is a powerful instrument of power, of domination, of taking people in their places and cutting the debate. But one thing that I think is important to remember is this is an European or a Western question. I think in the rest of the world, maybe with exception of some parts of Latin America, this issue is not existent. This is a white man's issue, not a war issue. But in a way, all this casuistic about find cases and definitions exactly what is anti-Semite or anti-Semitic or not. Is I remember that the theologues, the Christian theologues in the Middle Age, have a long list of sins, and doing this is sin, doing that is sin, doing the other thing is also sin, and that is not sin. And I think this is an enormous distraction from the real issues. We should discuss politics. We should discuss the problems the world have, and this is an invented issue that distract us. And put us a lot of energy, because it's incredible the amount of discussions about this issue all over the academia in Western countries. This is what I wanted to hear your reaction.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting what you say. I mean, it's I mean, is this something that you find particularly in Sweden that the debate, discussion is going in the direction in which you've just described?
Well, yes, in Sweden it's terrible. There is an orthodoxy here, and there are a kind of what people in America discuss it, a new religion in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, after the Six-Day War, when people started to talk about the Holocaust, and in America was a lot of discussions about a new religion. This here is a secular religion, and you must be a part of it. If not, you are condemned. You are outside society.
Mm. Well, certainly. I mean, it's very interesting what you say. It's a bit late to sort of open this up now, but certainly it's important to recognize the role that the Holocaust is being forced to play in these debates, and and there has been this very unpleasant and very manipulative use of the Holocaust um, by Zionists, basically, in order to justify what's being done. But there's quite an interesting development now, in a way, in that, and I've been reading recently that the whole area of genocide studies at universities, some universities in America and elsewhere, is being looked at again now, because, of course, genocide studies, began because of the Holocaust, to be fair, and it wasn't intended as a, something, to be sort of purely lessons as far as Jews are concerned. It was supposed to be wider than that. But now that the people who faced the Holocaust, experienced the Holocaust, and were destroyed in the Holocaust, that is that they are now somehow linked to an actual genocide that's happening today, is very troubling and very disturbing, and making some academics think again about the whole discussion about genocide and what it is, because it's quite clear that what's going on in Gaza is comes under the definition of genocide. So that's really something which we have to watch very carefully, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. I think, Nama, you still have your hand from before, I guess? Or you raised your hand again? I'm not sure. Yeah, so I think with this from beginning with anti-Semitism, and we ended up starting a new discussion on the term of genocide, I think we can wrap up for tonight. It was a very, very interesting lecture and debate and exchanges. It remain very relevant and important for our day-to-day fight on pushing back against IHRA and this manipulation. And thank you again, Tony, for the time to clarifying the emergence of this manipulation that you have observed yourself.
Thank you very much, Yoav, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's been very interesting.
Okay. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.